Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and today we're talking which decks have the highest average win rate across the entire format so far for Celestial Guardians. We are on the Limitless.com webpage, the place where all of the tournaments happen and where we get all of the data and statistics. And yeah, we're going to go ahead and take a look at which decks so far have the highest average win rate. Now, before we get into it, a couple of things to mention is that win rate isn't the highest sort of end-all be-all type thing, right? If a deck has a really high win rate, it could have a high win rate for a number of different reasons. It could just be that it's a small sample size and that deck, got lucky in terms of the matchups that it's hit so far, or it could be that the deck is inherently really, really strong, or of course the sample size is just really small and it doesn't give us that much information. So win rates aren't the end-all be-all, but I do believe they're really interesting data to take a look at. So in this video, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the deck lists with the highest average win rate, and we'll talk a little bit about those decks and why I believe they have such a high win rate. Alright guys, let's get into it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The support has been incredible over the last few days, and I really, really appreciate it. So if you guys would hit that subscribe button, it really does mean a lot. It helps out the channel in a lot of different ways. Let's get right into it. So here, we are looking at basically all of the data accumulatively for the entire Celestial Guardians format. And what we can do is basically filter all of these decks because by default, they're filtered by their meta share. And as we can see, the meta is actually very well spread. The highest win share out of any, or meta share out of any deck is Solgaleo and Skarmory at 9.7, but that's actually on the decline. So what we're going to see is a very balanced metagame in terms of the, diversity of which decks people are playing. But we can filter by the win rate, the total win rate. And I believe the data here might surprise you guys. So let's just get right into it, and then we'll kind of explain why these decks maybe have such high win rates. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, bang, there we go. All right, here we are. These are the decks with the highest win rates so far in this particular format. Again, 7,000 matches have been played, so the sample size in total is pretty large. I know it's early on in this format, things are still getting figured out, but I do believe this data is still going to be pretty interesting. So here we go. The number one highest win rate so far in this particular format is actually Greninja and Giratina. This is going to be with Oricorio. We've talked about this a lot over the last few days. Now, this is only the 27th most played deck of this format. And what we can do is we can go ahead and open this up. And as we see, smaller sample size here, a big reason why its win rate is probably so high. We see 74 wins and 39 losses. Now, that is about 100 plus games, so a decent little sample size, but a very good win rate for these particular deck lists here. And we can go ahead and we can just see all of the different finishes that people have had and all of the instances where this deck has seen play. Now let's go ahead and take a look here at the highest placing deck list. And I believe this is going to be the deck that did do well, of course, at the Ursa Days tournament recently that got top 4. And Greninja and Oricorio and Giratina is a really good deck list. I think that right now, as the format is going, I will say that this is probably not a deck that is as well positioned as it was in that first week. Things like Garchomp and Rampardos are everywhere in the format. And of course, we still have at least a chance to win that matchup with things like Greninja and Giratina, but Oricorio is not providing us really any value. So this is a really, really strong meta-call deck, basically an Oricorio auto-win deck that is exceptionally good in even the matchups where Oricorio isn't necessarily that good in, but really, really good in the matchups where Oricorio helps you with, right? The combination of Greninja and Oricorio is, of course, just really, really strong. And like I said, I did make a video, and I've talked about this deck time and time again, because I did have this in the S tier of my tier list, because I do think that as far as Oricorio decks go, this is at the very, very top. Now, we're seeing a little bit of an imbalance in the metagame currently, at least in ranked battles right now, and probably in the upcoming tournaments. Fighting is going to see way more play, specifically things like Garchomp, because it is, of course, really good against Oricorio, but it's just really strong in general, and Garchomp Rampardos can win matchups even against things like Gueritina Dark Ry and non-Oricorio decks. So I think that this deck list having the highest win rate is probably an example, I would say, of the format being a little bit in its infancy, and basically Oricorio and at least really well-built Oricorio decks having a massive advantage early on in this format. So that's the number one highest win rate deck is actually Greninja Giratina, but that's probably going to go down as time goes on. I'm pretty confident in that. It's only the 27th most played deck currently. I do suspect more people will play it, but at the moment I also think that Snorlax Giratina is by far the more common way to play it. Oricorio is really, really good, and what we're going to see, truthfully, is that Oricorio is going to see less play because there's a lot of fighting, but because there's so many fighting decks, I think things like Giratina and Darkrai will probably end up doing extremely well at the next tournament, and it's just a really good choice in ranked battles right now, which will then drive Oricorio back up. It's going to be sort of this three-way kind of teeter-totter with the hand movements there in terms of, the balancing of the decks right now, but certainly right now, seemingly seems to be very high on the fighting on the fighting side of things and the counter Oricorio side of things currently. So this deck having the highest win rate is definitely interesting. I think it's a phenomenal deck list, but I think that because it's done so well, it's going to start doing a lot less well basically as time goes on. Now, number 2 is really interesting, and that is Incineroar, and Turtonator here. Again, very small percent of the meta share, 36th, only 0.5% of the meta share here, but it does have a 62% win rate. So let's go ahead and let's talk about Incineroar and Turtonator, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So what we're actually going to do here for sure is look at the matchup. So 59 wins, 34 losses, and even smaller sample size than the previous deck list. Again, so, you know, put as much weight into these particular decks as you would like. I do think both of these decks are good, but I think that the small sample size really reflects that. Of course, if they had seen more play, they probably would have, of course, had a probably closer win rate to 50%. But anyway, let's go ahead, take a look at the matchup specifically for Incineroar and Turtonator. And what we can see here is probably a really balanced matchup spread across the board. So 5-6 against Gueritina Dark Ry, 5-4 against Giratina Snorlax, 6-2 versus Solgaleo, 5-2 against Charizard Incineroar, 50% here against Garchomp, and then 3-0 against Charizard, 3-0 against Pikachu EX and Luxray. Again, kind of random matchups here, but really just kind of, you know, balanced across the board. It's a small sample size, so it hasn't played any particular deck that often, but against some of the more popular decks, we see about a 50% win rate, and it does really well against some of these really not great deck lists, especially some of these grass decks, right? So that's why I think Incineroar and Turtonator is actually a really quality deck list. It's something that not many people are playing. I think they're choosing to play Incineroar with Charizard, which I think is definitely a good deck, but I think that Turtonator is really slept on, and I think that's where we can kind of pull a lot of info from this, is that decks like Incineroar with Turtonator maybe are seeing a lot less play than, of course, and let's take a look quickly at one of the deck lists. Decks like this are seeing a lot less play than some other decks, but they're performing really well when they do see play. So basically what this says is that, is Incineroar the second best deck in the format? I mean, I don't think so. I certainly wouldn't consider it to be like a top 2 deck in the format. However, I do think that it should see more play. I think it deserves a lot more of a chance, and I think more people should try it out, especially given the fact that in its 100 games or so far, it's had a pretty phenomenal win rate. So definitely really fun. Incineroar Turtonator is an interesting deck. I actually played some games on stream with Incineroar and Turtonator, and I think it's really, really good. I think that it's basically a fire type deck that's very well protected against Oricorio, but Turtonator itself is a really, really good card. Double Kiawe, the whole idea with this deck is that we want to lead with Turtonator basically always. It does have access to Rocky Helmet here to deal even more chip damage. It kind of acts as a wall that we can actually just set up immediately with Kiawe if we get a little bit lucky and we do lead off and have it in our first hand or two. The other important thing to note is that we don't have to attack immediately with Turtonator. So the situations that I really love most about this deck is that if I do get 2 Turtonator on board and I do have one in the active spot, I'll maybe Kiawe the bench Turtonator and I'll start attaching to the active. That way, perhaps if our opponent doesn't actually KO us, we can just attach manually to Turtonator and then take that KO or take that attack, and then even after Turtonator gets KO'd, we can go into our second Turtonator, which should basically lead into Incineroar able to take a KO, even with Fire Fang, and not needing to get all of those energies. So I think it's actually a really good strategy. I think Turtonator actually kind of pairs perfectly with Incineroar, and like I said, I did play this on stream, so I should have some like stream highlights, some sort of a montage of me playing this deck that should go up on the channel pretty soon here. So if you're interested in this deck list, I should have some gameplay coming soon. But either way, I really do like Incineroar and Turtonator. I think it's probably one of the more disrespected decks of the format right now. Again, only the 36th most played deck. Definitely deserves to see more play. So next up at the number 3 most played, our highest win rate deck, and things are going to definitely drop down pretty drastically. I would say that these 2 decks are definitely outliers because in their limited play, they've had great performances. But after this, we're going to probably hit something that's probably a little bit more understandable in terms of which decks are where. And that is actually going to be Magnezone and Oricorio, right? So at the 12th most played deck and just under 2% of the meta share, we have a 57 2/3% win rate, which is pretty good. Now let's take a look in the matchups first of Magnezone and Oricorio, because this is the other way that people are playing Oricorio. So it's no surprise to me that in this first week, both of the top played Oricorio decks have basically some of the highest win rates. As we see, really, really strong against Gueritina Dark Ry, however, really bad against Giratina and Snorlax. Again, really good against Solgaleo, really good against Charizard, really bad against, Carnivine and Crobat for sure, really, really good against Charizard again, and then bad matchups again across the board against all of the fighting decks. And that's no surprise. That's realistically where this Oricorio deck comes in handy. It's extremely good against the non-counter Oricorio decks, but is extremely bad against the the counter Oricorio deck. So that's sort of where Oricorio sits in the format, and that's why I think the format got split down into 3 categories, which we talked about a couple times over the last few days anyway. But yeah, so really interesting to see Magnezone and Oricorio kind of having such a high win rate. It did make finals of the Ursa Days tournament, and like I said, with fighting being a lot less common after that first week of play and leading up to this first weekend's Ursa Days tournament, it actually just had the opportunity to do really good. I think for whatever the reason, a lot of people played Solgaleo and basically Charizard and Incineroar, especially to that first Ursa Days tournament, really opened up the pathway for a lot of these Oricorio decks to do really good. I don't suspect them to be as advantageous in the upcoming weeks or so. I think a lot of people have just leaned into fighting again for all of the reasons that we've talked about. It's good against Oricorio and good enough against all of the other decks that it's just really justifiably good to play it. However, that will probably lead things like Gueritina Dark Ry to, do really well in this upcoming week. But either way, here it is. And yeah, the only downside to this deck realistically is that Oricorio can't really get supported by like a bench Greninja or something like that, right? So Magnezone is a good attacker, but again, it's not a great attacker, and this is a Pokemon that gets basically destroyed by Rampardos and Garchomp. So we're basically giving ourselves a 0% chance against all of the fighting decks, whereas the Greninja and Giratina deck, you at least give yourself somewhat of a chance against those decks, but Magnezone with Oricorio is definitely not a bad deck at all. It just really is an absolute meta call. I wouldn't be surprised if it continued to place fairly well in these tournaments, because variance plays a factor in these small sample sized tournaments, where if you're playing 10, 15 games, realistically, it's pretty likely, or it's fairly likely, that you might hit like no fighting decks, right, in that sample size. So some people who are playing Oricorio are going to get lucky, and I think in a tournament setting, it's a much more, I guess, viable option than it would be maybe in ranked mode, which I think probably isn't super smart to be playing Oricorio right now in ranked mode because of all of the fighting decks. But anyway, Magnezone Oricorio, the 3rd highest win rate out of all of the decks so far of this format. And at number 4, we see our guy right here, not only the 4th highest win rate at 7.5% meta share, but literally the 2nd most played deck in the game. This should not be any surprise to you. This is Giratina and Dark Ry. Now, Giratina Dark Ry is quite literally probably the best, inherently the best deck in the game. It's got 2 really, really strong Pokemon. The strategy has been nailed down. Everybody knows how to play this deck. It's very, very flexible because you get access to a ton of trainer cards. By the way, 666 wins to 466 losses. That is a 200 game difference, justifying that win rate, which is crazy to me, even with 33 ties. So that is really, really phenomenal. This deck just in general, I think, dominates the metagame still, and really the only counter to this deck is Oricorio, which again kind of forces us to at least consider playing Oricorio in a tournament setting. And that's why I believe if Oricorio really falls off and everybody's playing fighting or fire or metal, I think realistically Giratina Dark Ry will kind of just farm the field. And that's the big downside, I think, currently right now. So we're going to be in this sort of this, like I said, sort of this this back and forth, this sort of shift of a lot of people playing fighting to counter the Oricorio decks, but we'll likely just go down to Giratina and Dark Ry. And let's take a look at the matchups here. So about 50% in the mirror matchup, that's to be expected here. A very good matchup against Solgaleo and Skarmory. A little bit under 50% against Charizard and Incineroar. Again, I think they're both ramp decks, but Charizard and Incineroar is definitely really, really strong in the late game. So that kind of makes a little bit of sense to me. But again, not a terrible win rate nonetheless. Only 10 game difference there. Very good win rates against Snorlax. Again, the big problem with Snorlax is that it does not do well against Giratina Dark Ry. That's why I'm not a huge believer in it currently. Big reason why I did not put it in S tier. Winning matchups against Lucario Rampardos, against Arceus Crobat, just barely losing a little bit to Charizard. Again, Charizard is kind of one of the other counters to it. And then again, losing matchups against Magnezone and Oricorio. Very good matchup against Garchomp, and basically good matchups against basically everything except Meowscarada, and if we go down here, Greninja and Giratina EX. So very much limiting in our counterplay options to this deck list, as it absolutely kind of dominates the entire field, and that's tough. So I think that that's sort of the one aspect of Giratina Dark Ry that I believe is just, it makes it a little bit daunting, I believe. Like, a lot of people have expressed their negative opinions on the Oricorio decks and not playing them. However, The one thing about Oricorio is that it should keep Gueritina Dark Ry in check, because no matter how you look at it, Gueritina Dark Ry is the strongest, the best inherently, just the best deck in Pokemon Pocket. It still is. But now, again, we have hard counters to it, but anything that's not a hard counter to Gueritina Dark Ry probably will lose to it, and that's definitely a little bit tough. But this is what people are playing right now. Some people play Guzma, but I don't think Guzma's as useful, really, because grass decks with Leaf Cape aren't seeing really any play whatsoever, and then Solgaleo is definitely going down in play, but we do well in that matchup no matter what. So basically, one Mars, one red card. I think a little bit of disruption here. We still have Sabrina Red, Leaf, Pokemon Center Lady, and then 2 Rocky Helmets specifically, I think, for the Oricorio matchup as well, which, you know, we're going to kind of lose to anyway. And then 2 potions. So this is sort of the highest placing deck for Gueritina Dark Ry, but again, very, very flexible in terms of how we can build the deck list. We all know about it. Not much to really talk about. Generally accepted as just the best deck in the game. So thank God for Oricorio, kind of, is what I'm thinking of. Now, let's look at some really interesting stuff here. Now, we're going to skip over Giratina and Greninja because this is basically just the same thing. For whatever reason, Limitless sort of splits it into 2 categories. So if you combine them to both of these, they would both be still the highest, like one of the highest win rate decks, but it would be a little bit more played. So whatever the reason, Limitless kind of splits Giratina Dark Ry or not Giratina Dark Ry, Giratina and Greninja Giratina for whatever the reason, just because of the different amounts of cards that they're playing in the deck lists. But basically, these 2 are the same archetypes. They're just split a little bit, so keep that in mind. We're going to skip over this, but take a look quickly at Crobominable and Greninja. So another deck that is only 31st in the meta share, only 6.2% or 0.62% of the meta share, but a 56.5% win rate for the Crab. Now, I actually put Crab in A tier because, yet again, when I took a look at all of these decks and I tested them myself, things like Turtonator and Incineroar and Crobominable and Greninja were decks that just didn't see nearly as much play, but had placements, had high placements in large tournaments and really good win rates whenever they did see play. So this is something that I would categorize very, very similarly to Incineroar and Turtonator, where I believe it deserves to see more play. And let's go ahead and take a look at the matchups quickly. And as we can see, we're going to struggle very much so against Giratina and Darkrai. That's kind of to be expected. You know, these sort of kind of ramp up decks don't necessarily or do really well against sort of these more aggro kind of in-your-face Crobominable decks for sure. But even across the board, against Solgaleo and Skarmory, bad against Snorlax, but basically pretty good against everything else. As we see, Crobominable is kind of farming all of the other decks in the format. So what I would say with Crobominable is that it's definitely a good deck list, but struggling against the Giratina decks is a bit of a downside. However, we are going to basically just completely farm these Fire decks, which is really, really good if Fire continues to see play. And I think Fire seeing a lot of play early in this format really does sort of allow Crobominable to be really good. But if Fire sees a lot less play and things like, if we can take a look at the fighting matchups, do we have any examples here? 2-0 against Lycanroc, 1-0 against Garchomp, so basically nothing to really go off of here. But supposedly you would think that this deck has a pretty decent matchup against the fighting decks for sure, but definitely struggling against Giratina. And that's a downside to this deck for sure. But again, kind of a meta call. So it's interesting for sure. 64 wins, 48 losses, a small sample size. I wouldn't put too much weight into Crobominable, but I do think that it's actually a completely good quality deck. Again, it's just something that I think probably deserves to see more play. But with all of the top decks in the format, I just don't really suspect Crobominable to really emerge as something that sees that much play. In fact, if anything, I don't think it might even go down in play, realistically. Even though, if we look at the win rates, it's number 5 on the highest win rate. It just isn't something that I think that many people are interested in playing. One thing to note, though, is that it does play Greninja, and Greninja can just win you games with Rare Candy. So a lot of the highest win rate decks are just going to be playing Greninja, and that's because Greninja is exceptionally good in the format right now. Next up at number 6, we have Gallade, which is a very, very small sample size, only 0.41% of the meta share, but it's done fairly well at 55.56%. Let's quickly take a look at the matchups for Gallade. We're going to see here that we do pretty decent against a lot of stuff here, but if we go down, we'll probably see some matchups where we just kind of get farmed, and that's probably going to be a lot of these grass decks. Yeah, pretty likely. Yeah, a lot of the grass decks. And then what else do we kind of lose to? I mean, I don't know. This is all really small sample sizes, but against some of the more common decks, our matchups is actually fairly decent. Again, super small sample size. 3-4 against Gueritina Dark Ry, 3-2 against Solgaleo Skarmory, 3-2 against Charizard and Incineroar, 2-1 against all these other decks. So this is an interesting thing about Gallade, because I've seen some people talk about it. And I think that at the same time, I think that Gallade is a totally fine deck in the metagame right now. I just don't really see it being that relevant because Giratina is still seeing play in so many decks. And Giratina will one-shot you no matter kind of the scenario, especially with a Greninja ping or a Dark Ry ping. If you're going up against Giratina, you're going to struggle kind of no matter the facet. So I like Gallade, and I like the ability to go into it with X speed, but that, or not X speed, sorry, with Rare Candy. But as we see in this deck list, we're not playing Rare Candy because it's not really something that you need with Gallade because you're kind of using it in the late game because it does more damage based off of the energies that are attached to our opponent's Pokemon. And early in the game, our opponent's not going to have that much energy, right? So it just makes sense to not even need Rare Candy with Gallade because you're going to be using it sort of later in the game anyway. So there's Gallade. Some people have talked about it. I certainly think it's totally fine in the metagame, but I don't think that it's really something that I would put like super amount, like a ton of weight in. Again, it's probably underrated. It probably deserves to see more play than the 42nd most played deck in the game. But I think, again, there's just a lot of other fighting decks that people are playing, so it kind of makes sense that it's not seeing that much play. Now, the next thing that's surprising to me is actually going to be Arceus EX with Crobat and probably Carnivine as well. This is a really, really interesting deck list. I think that Arceus Crobat with Carnivine is actually better now than maybe it ever has been. I think that Carnivine is certainly really, really useful into the fighting decks. However, one thing you need to note is that the fighting decks are probably just going to start playing, because if Oricorio sees less play, they're just going to play the Dragon type Gible, which is basically the same card. It's just Dragon type and it's not weak to Grass. So that basically means that Carnivine can't take the one-hit KO, and then if it can't take the one-hit KO on the active Gible, then you're not actually that good of a deck list, and you're actually not that strong against Garchomp specifically, because Garchomp can actually just KO Arceus like for weakness, right? You can just basically linear attack the bench, play a Cyrus, bring it up, and then KO it, right? So it's actually interesting that both Crobat, I think, and Arceus are weak to fighting. However, Carnivine is strong against fighting, so it's like you have that advantage of Carnivine being able to KO the Gibbles, but as soon as Garchomp stops playing fighting type Gibble and they start playing Dragon type Gibble, by the way, let's take a look at a deck list, then you're honestly not even at a big advantage because most of your deck is actually just weak to fighting, and that's kind of a downside. I mean, Carnivine can do a lot of damage, but I believe Garchomp plays 2 Lily anyway, so it's probably not even that big of an advantage, honestly. But anyway, this deck is good for a variety of reasons. I just think that Crobat and Carnivine and Arceus, like with Rare Candy, this deck has gotten a little bit more fast-paced, a little bit more aggressive. The only downside here is when you're playing Carnivine with Crobat, you're playing Grass energies in this deck. Like, there's no reason for you to ever play Grass and Dark energies. And the main reason for that is because Carnivine is your true leadoff option. You're never really reliant on attacking with Crobat, and in fact, if you are in a position to attack with Crobat, you're probably not in a position to win the game anyway. So you have to play just Grass energies, which means that yes, we're not able to utilize Crobat's attack, but that's probably fine for the most part. But this strategy is just really good. It's actually really, really similar to like Snorlax, Giratina, and Greninja in the terms of you have a leadoff, you have a bench support sniping Pokemon, except Crobat can't hit the bench, which does make it, in my mind, a little bit worse than Greninja. But it does do 30 damage, but only to the active, and then we have our EX sort of sweeper Pokemon in Arceus. But Arceus, again, weak to fighting, and that is certainly pretty tough for our guy Arceus here for sure. So this matchup is interesting. I think this deck is really good. Again, really good against Oricorio while also being strong just across the board anyway. It kind of functions actually in a very similar vein to things like Snorlax and Greninja, and or Snorlax and Giratina and Greninja and Garchomp, where it's like you're good against Oricorio, but you're actually pretty good across the board. So I kind of put it in that category. I put Arceus, Crobat, and Garchomp and Rampardos, and then Snorlax and Giratina, all within the same sort of bracket of decks that are strong against Oricorio decks, but also good enough to win matchups against other stuff. And I think that that makes all 3 of those decks really well positioned and probably good choices. But let's take a look at the matchups real quick. And we see here about a 50% against Solgaleo and Skarmory, about a 40% win rate against Gueritina Dark Ry, about a 50% against Charizard and Incineroar, a little bit of a losing win rate against Snorlax, and then a decent win rate here against Lucario Rampardos, definitely a high win rate against Lycanroc at 4 and 9, pretty even across all of the other decks, but then the Aerodactyl as well, a high win rate, and then really, really good, again, against Magnezone and Oricorio. So it's interesting. Again, I think that Garchomp kind of bypasses a lot of this, but as we see, actually good win rates against a lot of the fire decks as well, which is pretty interesting. Is Garchomp on this list anywhere? Can we take a look at it? So 3 and 6, it's actually a losing matchup against Garchomp, which is what I was saying. So I think that Arceus and Crobat was a better meta call in this first week, being able to both win all of the matchups, but specifically against Oricorio. But again, I really don't think your matchup against Garchomp is very good. I suspected that as much, which is why I kind of mentioned it. So yeah, Arceus and Crobat is a good deck list, but but it's something that I would also kind of expect to see on the decline, especially if Garchomp ends up seeing more play, and also if they swap the Fighting Gible for the Dragon Gible, basically. But anyway, what else do we got here? Next up, we've actually got the man himself, and that is Garchomp and Rampardos. And yeah, so again, I put this in my S tier for a variety of reasons, 148 to 122. I think this deck list is actually becoming more well-positioned as time goes on. I just kind of find it to be a really, really strong deck that's just in general very well-positioned. So as we see here, this Garchomp deck is playing the Dragon-type Gible. Now, it's interesting, right? Depending on if like Arceus Crobat sees a lot of play or if any grass decks really see a lot of play, I think that this Gible is certainly the better option. However, even playing the fighting option isn't that bad, because even against our Carnivine and Arceus, they have to lead with Carnivine, they have to be going second, and then they also have to have Arceus on the bench. So it's not like extremely likely that they go ahead and turn 1 KO your Gible if you were the fighting type, because you're weak to grass. But I mean, to be fair, the fighting type Gible does hit more things for weakness. You can hit Oricorio for weakness, you can hit Magnemite for weakness, you can hit, Zubat and Arceus and all these types of things. Snorlax is another one. So I actually kind of like the fighting Gible, but I really think if we're just trying to absolutely eliminate Carnivine from the format, we would just play the Dragon type Gible. But again, oftentimes we're just rare candying on our first or second turn with Garchomp anyway, so it really is what it is. All right, we're back. Sorry, I hit my microphone and I disconnected it, so we had to take a little break there. What was I saying? Yeah, I think Garchomp very, very well positioned. I just think that it does a few things that a few decks can do, which is basically guarantee your win rate against the Oricorio decks while just being really, really strong against the variety of all of the other decks that you're probably also going to have to worry about, whether it's Solgaleo, whether it's other fighting decks, whether it's Gueritina Dark Ry, which you're probably fairly decent against, although it's probably not a great matchup. Charizard, Incinor, all of the stuff like that. Snorlax as well. So I think that's really where kind of Garchomp kind of fell in place. And let's take a look at the matchups. And I just think it really comes down to really good win rates against specific decks that are probably just seeing a lot of play. So as we see here, 60% against Giratina Snorlax, but only a 26% against Giratina Darkrai, which is quite bad. I do think that we can adjust our deck list in some ways to kind of counter this. So we'll see exactly how that kind of functions. But yeah, unfortunately, there's no way around losing to Giratina Darkrai. It's just kind of a better deck list in general, but really solid win rates against, again, just basically everything else that's not Giratina Darkrai, except Solgaleo is a bit of a struggle here, 6 and 14. That's a small sample size. I actually wouldn't put too much weight in this. Same with Giratina Darkrai. I think that these matchups are actually better than the data suggests, but they're probably still not phenomenal, but just basically winning matchups against everything else. If we take a look here, Magnezone and Oricorio, 5-0, that should be an auto-win matchup, basically. Giratina Greninja, also probably a really good matchup. So yeah, that's kind of where Garchomp fills in, right? If a lot of people are playing Snorlax to counter Oricorio, or if a lot of people are playing Oricorio, Garchomp really is the best option. So that's why I was saying that Garchomp likely kind of taking over the format, at least for now, because it has remained as sort of that best sort of counter Oricorio option. However, Giratina Darkrai will likely sort of take that spot, and then more people will play Oricorio, and then the cycle will continue. But anyway, no surprise to me that Garchomp is that high up here on the win rates. If I'm being honest with you, I think Garchomp is actually a really, really strong deck. And then if we go down here, I'm not going to dive in. Actually, let's quickly, I guess, talk about Decidueye and Lurantis at the 21st most played deck, 0.75% of the meta share and 54% win rate. I think Decidueye Lurantis is fine. Again, I just think that, unfortunately, and let's take a look at this list here that got third out of 395. I think, unfortunately, grass decks just, don't get enough love. I think that in a format where Oricorio didn't exist, and then the way that people were playing Oricorio didn't exist, that basically Giratina Darkrai would have ran show, and then a lot of these grass decks could have had potential. But the upside to playing Lurantis with Decidueye, and even with Dartrix against Oricorio, you can kind of deal with Oricorio at least decent enough, and we should have good enough matchups really across the board. Grass really does feel like the only matchup that, or the only deck list that really has just sort of an open matchup spread where, yes, we're probably going to get dominated by the fire decks, but everything else seems to be fairly decent for Decidueye. Now, I think that because this is a small sample size, that Lurantis sort of took advantage of the fact that, again, the small sample size that this deck has played, it's done fairly well, but again, I wouldn't really consider this to be like a top tier meta deck. I think I put it in B tier, which I think is probably the correct place for this deck, but Decidueye is a really good card. It's just a bit awkward. I think grass in general, a bit awkward. If more people played it, I think that it would have a chance to be better and be a little bit more of an official deck list. I think Decidueye has A tier potential for sure, given the sort of just the layout of the metagame right now, especially against things like Garchomp. against things like Gueritina Dark Ry. I think that Decidueye and other grass cards do really well. It's just that there's too many different grass type decks that people aren't really deciding on what the best one to play is. Whereas, you know, it's sort of in a similar situation to fighting. However, fighting has kind of overcome that and everybody's just playing Garchomp. Grass is certainly in sort of a similar position where there's just like 3, 4, or 5 grass decks and nobody really knows which one's the best because nobody's really playing them enough to really kind of settle that information. But anyway, Decidueye is really good. We have Leaf Cape, we have Lily, we even can Poison Barb the Lurantis, we have Erica's, we can Rare Candy and Decidueye, we can just sort of Petal Blizzard and do a lot of damage and then kind of sweep with Decidueye. This deck has a lot of synergy. It's a good strategy and I actually like the deck a lot. Unfortunately, just such a small sample size, it's hard to put too much value into it. I guess we can take a look at that win rate real quick. Where is it? If we go up here, yeah, so the most played version of Decidueye is actually just Meowscarada, but it does not have a good win rate whatsoever. Let's take a look here at the matchups. Again, small sample size. Losing to Solgaleo, beating Giratina Snorlax, beating Arceus Crobat, and then actually kind of, well, beating Charizard, but losing to Charizard and Incineroar. Losing to Rampardos pretty heavily, which is kind of scary. Beating Gyarados, which again isn't really seeing play, and then everything is just basically such a small sample size. Like it's impossible to see. Basically, this deck hasn't seen enough play, so that we can't really just weigh it against the most played decks in the format, unfortunately. And I think that's sort of what we're going to see a lot oftentimes. But I do think that Decidueye and Lurantis is actually a fairly good deck. I just think it, you know, probably should see more play. And then skipping ahead here, some other decks that have really good win rates that this video is getting a bit too long, so we'll wrap it up soon. But Charizard and Incineroar, really respectable as the 4th most played deck to have a 53.5% win rate. Giratina Snorlax as the 3rd most played deck with a 52.9% win rate, definitely really good. More Crobominable with Palkia this time up here. And then Beedrill, like the small Beedrill with Beedrill EX, also fairly decent at 52%, 17th most played deck. And then a lot of these decks here are just sort of lesser played decks. Like as we see, it's just sort of tough to categorize as we go down which decks are great. And then we're going to fall closer to like 50%, right? So, and then quickly, like it's funny, like once you get down to like these 50% win rate decks like Solgaleo, Meowscarada, things like this, it's just a massive dip. And then we see all of these decks that are actually seeing a lot of play, but are just terribly performing. You know what I mean? Like it's a massive drop off. You have like some decks here that are outliers because they're not seeing that much play. You have a lot of decks here in this sort of 50 to 53% win rate range. And then if you go down, it's just, oh yeah, it's just a bunch of decks that are losing a tremendous amount. I mean, look at all of these deck lists here that people are playing that just have either not won a single game because they haven't seen much play, or they have actually seen a decent amount of play and they just aren't winning. Like Beedrill EX here, like a Alolan Raichu. There's just a lot of stuff that for whatever the reason people are choosing not to play, but at the same time probably makes a lot of sense because they really just aren't doing very well. Like Gyarados, Charizard, Moltres, just terrible. This is the 15th and 14th most played deck, but at a 42% win rate. If we go up, what are some negative outliers? Like Solgaleo Lunala. Actually, no, that's not the correct one. I've done this. I made this mistake before. It's categorized differently. If we go up more, can we find it up here maybe? Yeah. Oh, wait, that's Solgaleo Lunala. That's interesting. Let's go. Can we find it? Can we find it? Where is it? Should be somewhere up here. Because it has actually a fairly decent win rate. Maybe I won't be able to find it. Hold on. Can we find it? Is it up here? Oh, wait. We did oh. We're going the opposite way. Does this work this way? I don't know. I'm kind of lost right now. I'm not going to lie. Okay, anyway. All right, anyway, guys. You can go ahead and take a look at this webpage yourself. We're going to wrap up the video here. Hopefully this information was somewhat useful to you guys. Again, win rates aren't the end-all be-all. It's really not sort of like the... It's not like the #1 statistic that I would, you know, kind of say is like the most important thing to take a look at, but the data is interesting, like for sure. Because basically at the top, like what we can see are decks that are kind of underrated, but we can also see decks that are kind of overrated if we kind of go down a little bit, right? So that's really what this tells us. It is certainly very early on, so it's definitely hard for us to make like super accurate judgments just based off of win rate. But as time goes on, what we'll see is that the win rates will probably even out a little bit, and then the decks that maybe have still high win rates are definitely going to surprise us. But this video hopefully was somewhat interesting to you guys. Again, I like to cover the win rates in a specific video because after a week or 2 weeks of the format, I think the data does kind of surprise us. So again, take it all with a grain of salt, but go ahead. I'm going to link this webpage down in the description below so you guys can go ahead and take a look at this and let me know what you guys think. Anything that surprised you guys, anything that did not surprise you guys, or anything that you kind of think makes sense. Again, just comment below and let me know. Hopefully, we can have a nice little discussion about it in the comments. But anyway, guys, let's get out of here. Peace out. Have a good one. Stay tuned. Tomorrow, we're either going to do some ranked gameplay in a video, or we're maybe going to talk about my updated sort of ranked deck, list, best ranked list best ranked decks list video in tomorrow's video. So stay tuned for that. But anyway, guys, peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. And yeah, bye.